Hello. This is Chapter 14, Europe and the Atlantic World, 1550 to 1660. This is the last chapter we'll be covering in History 101. And in a way it's very fitting because this chapter is about us. It's about how Europe became part of the New World and, by extension, Virginia. The Atlantic world is a way to talk about the entire area of Europe, Africa, South America, Central America, the Caribbean, and of course North America, in a way that encompasses both sides. Now, the movement back and forth of people, animals, goods, etc., we call that the Columbian Exchange, of course, after Christopher Columbus, but he's not in the picture anymore. And in fact, the New World is no longer seen as this place across the ocean that's impossible to get to, that only great adventurers go there. It is a place that now becomes this journey of, it's difficult, but it's not something that's only done once or twice. This movement is going to continue on. It's going to become very important. So historians like to look at this acceleration of global connections as really changing the global ecosystem and becoming a real turning point in human history. Remember, the Western Hemisphere is something that the Europeans nor the Asians were counting on. It's brand new to them. The transfer is going to be from crops, especially the types of fruits and vegetables and legumes and things that were grown here in the Western Hemisphere that were not available to people in Europe. Also, animals are going to be moving along this Columbian Exchange. Mainly the flora and fauna of the New Hemisphere is going to be brought back as something that's going to be more of a curiosity, but the people in Europe who are used to certain standards of animals are going to bring livestock. They're going to bring horses. They're going to bring oxen to help them do work. Also, human populations are going to move in. And with human populations, of course, disease is going to follow. And because the people of the New World do not have the same immune system that the people of the Old World have, and vice versa, the chances and the absolute devastation of disease is going to really very much change the landscape of the New Hemisphere. There are historians who work on this who think possibly close to 90% of the Native American population, the people of North America and South America and Central America, close to 90% of their populations were wiped out by these new diseases and, of course, by the violence that's going to be coming. But one of the things that we'll find particularly interesting are these foodstuffs, these things that are going to come from the New World. I mean, obviously we think of corn, hot peppers are going to be exchanged, certain gourds, like pumpkins, are going to be exchanged. But on top of that, we're going to see some pretty normal, at least to us, vegetables and fruit that are going to move from the New World to the Old World. Potatoes and tomatoes. Imagine Italian food without pasta sauce, without tomato pasta sauce. Imagine Italian pizza without the tomato sauce underneath the cheese. That's Italy before 1550, before the Columbian Exchange. I'm not quite sure what they used. Pasta must have been very, very different before the Columbian Exchange. Because of the way the central and southern part of the hemisphere are going to be settled as opposed to the northern part, we're going to see some very different ways that the Europeans interact with the Native Americans there. Now, Spain, if you recall, will create colonial governments in Central America, in South America, mainly for ranching purposes and especially to get that silver out of Bolivia. But all of the land that is going to be taken will remain in the hands of the crown. It will be the King and Queen of Spain who will decide who will go, who will set up land, who will rule, and those, of course, will be the Spaniards. And so this intermixing of how these people are going to react to the native population that's there, it's not very it's very one-sided. How about that? The Spaniards who come will replicate the feudal system that had been prominent in Europe. They created their own feudal systems in New Spain, even to the point that they instituted a form of serfdom with the native population, so that they had workers on the estates that they had. They essentially became the lords of the manor, trying to recreate that feudal system. And because so few Spaniards came to the New World, we're going to see a sense of hierarchies, with, of course, the Spaniards on top and the indigenous people and slaves on the bottom. This hierarchy, this social hierarchy, was based on who was your parents, who were your grandparents. This pattern is going to continue for quite some time, with those who had Spanish parents, both from Europe, will be on the highest level of the hierarchy. Those who intermixed with the native population and created a mixed system with indigenous women created part of this caste system. So it was this hierarchy that was created in terms of the society and where people were. And of course, indigenous people and slaves were on the bottom of this hierarchy. But this was an extremely important thing to get settled. Those people who intermixed, the mixed descent people, we call them Creoles. And they were in the middle of this hierarchy. You can see by this illustration very clearly who was on top and how they intermingled. Now, England is going to create a completely different colonial system, because the colonies in the New World that England is going to start will not be possessions of the crown. They will be private ventures. They will be groups of investors in England who will put together limited partnerships, and they will buy the boats, supply the people, and create an entire movement of colonists with the idea that they were to become self-sufficient in the New World, and that they would send back goods for the British. Hopefully, fingers crossed, gold. Didn't work out that way very much. There was something even more valuable that's going to be found here in Virginia that's going to be sent back. More on that later. So when the English came, and there were different waves of them, some came for economic purposes, others, like the people we called the Pilgrims, who landed on Plymouth Rock in 1620, those people came for religious freedom. They wanted to be able to worship in the way that they wanted to worship. And so they set up a colony so that they could do just that. Other colonies, like Jamestown here in Virginia, was set up to be more of an economic colony. The English colonies left for the most part, very early on, left the Native Americans alone. There was not the intermingling, there was not the intermarriage. They kept them at arm's distance. So definitely a very different feel between how Spain was colonizing and how England was colonizing. So the colonialists from the English settlement are going to start to branch out. When they realized that gold was not littering the beaches, they needed to move inland to set up what would become plantations, to start growing crops to send back to England. That meant not just intermingling with the native population, that meant taking land away from them. Sometimes this was done through a negotiated process, and sometimes this was done through violent intervention. But to a European, this was free land, and so they wanted to make the most of it. Remember, under the feudal system, land was wealth, and here they had an entire continent to take over. So in England, problems within the church, problems with the English Civil War that I'm going to talk about in a few minutes, are going to lead to basically overcrowding and problematic situations that encouraged people to leave England and come to North America. And some of them came as partners in the business. Some of them came as workers that had been brought in to do the work on the plantations, and others sold themselves into indentured servitude, were basically coming to help work on these new plantations, especially that cash crop that we know so well here in Virginia, tobacco. The British, and then later the rest of Europe, became addicted to nicotine. It was not available in the Old World, and so tobacco was the cash crop that encouraged the English to settle in North America. Very different than the Spaniards, who did not find this sort of cash crop. Eventually, we're going to see slavery is going to pop up here in North America. It had been going on in a big way throughout the Caribbean. More than 7 million slaves are probably laboring and dying in these sugar plantations, tobacco plantations, etc. So that's a number that was huge. It dwarfed the number of Europeans coming, and yet the Europeans tended to survive, and the African slaves were worked to death. That's kind of basically an assumption on the Europeans' part, that the African slaves would not last that long. Once they were used up, they were no longer useful. So about 1.5 million Europeans came to the Americas, and so they tried to control these slaves who labored for them. There were colonial agents who worked to import these slaves because so many of them died. Now, the big cash crop for the production here in the New World, especially in the Caribbean, in the tropical and subtropical regions, was, of course, sugar. Europe developed a sweet tooth. And the sugar plantations were among the most odious, the worst places for these slaves to work. The slave trade, in fact, was so big that it became, what's the way to put it? It was commodified. They set up systems to take care of it. It was not a haphazard sort of business. It was very much a delivery business. If you look at this illustration from a manual on shipping across the Atlantic, you will see the 4 decks of this ship loaded to go from Africa to probably the Caribbean. On the far left, you have the lowest hold of the ship. That's where barrels are neatly stacked, how they fit in nicely into the hull of the ship, carrying perhaps fresh water, provisions, etc. The next image is the next deck up. You see more barrels. They're very carefully stacked so they don't roll around, but they're stacked so that you can get the maximum amount of barrels on this ship. The third image is particularly troublesome. Those are human bodies. This diagram showed the best way to stack as many human bodies as they could on this ship, with the full knowledge that 50% of the slaves in this ship would probably die during the voyage. Maybe 40% of those who actually made it to the Americas would be alive still after 2 years. This commodification and actual concept of how to make money off of the trade of human flesh was something that the Europeans would get very good at. And this was not just the British, this was not just the Portuguese. There's quite a few different people doing this. And of course, for the slaves themselves, this was a heart-wrenching, horrific life to be torn from their homes, sold into slavery, and being worked to death on these plantations. So we saw revolts, we saw suicides, infanticides, and escapes. There will be a handful of escaped slave communities, but those will be the exception rather than the rule. In Brazil, they had a community of close to 20,000 former slaves that will gather over the course of the century and create their own sort of township. In Europe, the population density, especially in the urban areas, is growing by leaps and bounds, thanks to better agriculture, trade, etc. Many of those people wanted out of the old world. Many of those people wanted to get to the new world and that promise of seemingly unlimited land that they could take over. Those that remained are going to be affected by, of course, the Reformation. The Reformation was no longer this change of ideology. It became wars, especially in France. France had been very, very Catholic since almost the inception of the Roman Catholic Church. And so these monarchies were desperately trying to hold on to their lands. They are asked for more taxes, and they wanted uniformity of religion. Remember, the Catholic Church was the legitimacy that these kings and nobles needed to stay in power. The Protestant churches did not offer this same sort of legitimacy. However, France had a growing population of Protestant adherents, and there was a move to try to get rid of them. During these wars, the Peace of Augsburg in 1555 tried to impose a religious conformity on this divisive land of Europe. However, this, of course, is going to anger the Protestants because, of course, the religious conformity was to be Roman Catholicism. And so battles broke out in France between the Calvinists and the other groups of Protestants in France and the French crown. There was a considerable concentration of Huguenots, which was the name for a certain group of French Protestants in southern France. And this is interesting mainly because southern France had been home of some of the larger heresies that had occurred in the early part of the Middle Ages. The Cathars, for example, the Waldensians. These heretical groups had been smashed in the 13th century, or at least attempted to smash them in the 13th century, and in the same locations, Protestantism grew up as well. This is going to come to a head during a particular wedding ceremony. Now, those of you who are familiar with Games of Thrones, especially, I believe it was the first season, the Red Wedding, what I'm going to tell you about was the inspiration for the that's really hard to say, the Red Wedding. Henry of Navarre, a nobleman and a Protestant from the south of France, was to marry the Catholic sister of the king. So he was a step away from the throne once this marriage occurred, but not necessarily king. There was already a king on the French throne. However, the mother of the king, a woman by the name of Catherine de' Medici, that should be a very familiar name to you by now, she wanted to get rid of these Protestants and saw this wedding, this royal wedding, as a way to do this. She had made some plans with various Catholic factions throughout France to try to get rid of these Protestants. Because, of course, for a wedding, especially a wedding of that elite stature, everyone wanted to come. Everyone wanted to be there. And the wedding was held in Paris, and it was a really big deal. Paris was still very much a medieval city, meaning that it had walls around it, and gates, and guards. And on the day of this wedding, it was held on August 24th, 1572. This day was also known as St. Bartholomew's Day. The wedding and all the guests are in Paris, and Catherine de' Medici and the other Catholic plotters closed the gates, shut everybody within the city of Paris, and began the slaughter. They figure about 2,000 to 3,000 Parisian Protestants who had come to the wedding or maybe had lived in Paris were slaughtered. This is called the St. Bartholomew's Day Massacre. We don't know exactly how many people were killed. We do know from the written reports that the people outside of Paris didn't quite know what was going on until downriver of the city, the river Seine flows through the city. Downriver of the city, the bodies of the Protestants that had been murdered and tossed into the river started floating down the river. And this started even more fighting outside of Paris. Thousands more Protestants were killed during this massacre. It was particularly nasty. Henry and his wife, the bride and groom, escaped. They got out of Paris, but the fighting continued on for 2 more decades. In order to get married to a Catholic, Henry had to renounce his Protestantism and become a Catholic. And at some point around 1580, the king died and the crown went to Henry. So France had a renounced Protestant on the throne. And because he had these certain connections, networks, and sympathies, he rode up and issued the Edict of Nantes in 1598. Now, this edict established Roman Catholicism as the official religion for the Kingdom of France. However, it allowed for Huguenots and other Protestants to worship as they desired, to attend university, and to serve in public office, all ways that young men could work their way up into society. It also reinforced that regional autonomy in southwestern France, where the Huguenots mainly settled. So that's France. It had a horribly violent few decades trying to settle out the religious question. England and Spain, you can probably imagine, because one settled in North America, the other settled in South America, there would be some animosity between these two in competition for who got more land from the Atlantic world. And of course, England was Protestant, it was Church of England, or as we call it, Anglican, and Spain was firmly Catholic. When Elizabeth I took the throne, Catholicism was basically forced out as the official religion, and the Church of England was triumphant. In order to try to whittle away at the power of Spain, the English would set up a handful of sea captains to go out and plunder Spanish vessels. Remember, these vessels were carrying silver back to Spain. They were very, very enticing targets. So Elizabeth's reign will be one of animosity towards not just the Spanish Catholics, but of course also the Catholics in Ireland, and basically anyone, they supported anyone who was against the Catholics in Spain, such as the Dutch. The British, during Elizabeth's reign, supported the Dutch. The Dutch, in turn, were some of the major trading partners with England at the time. King Philip of Spain is going to decide enough is enough. He wanted to take care of that upstart queen in England, and he sent his largest fleet, called the Invincible Armada, to England to try to overthrow Elizabeth. It failed. It failed partially because of the weather. The Invincible Armada was done in by a very nasty storm, and it became seen by the English as not just a lucky victory and being safe for a while from a Spanish invasion, but actually the hand of God at work, supporting the English in their attempt to stay away from Catholic Spain. Because of the religious wars happening between England and Spain, because of the religious wars happening in the interior of France, and because there have been various pockets of Protestant and non-Catholics rubbing up against Catholics, we're going to see a war break out that will be one of the bloodiest wars in European history, the 30 Years' War. It's going to begin in Central Europe against Catholic Austria, or as it was known, the Habsburg Empire, against the Hussite Protestants in the Czech lands. It's going to begin in 1618, and with the Battle of Bílá Hora, the Habsburgs will be victorious over the Protestant Church. It's going to start because there had been a delegation sent from the Habsburg Empire to Prague to try to encourage these people to come back and become Catholics, and these two envoys will be tossed out the window of one of the castles in Prague. It's called a defenestration. It's a fancy Latin word for throwing somebody out the window. This was the second time this had happened in Prague. The first one was way back in the Hussite Rebellion of 1419. But this second defenestration ended quite differently because the guys who were thrown out of the window survived. They landed on a pile of refuse, mainly animal manure, and they survived, and they limped back, and that's when the Habsburgs declared war on the Czech lands, and they would eventually beat them. Now, strangely enough, this 30 Years' War is not going to break down nicely and neatly on the various religious sides. It starts out that way, but as more countries join in and try to get land from each other, it's going to be a real mess, and you're going to end up with weird groupings of countries. Catholic France is going to be supporting Lutheran Sweden, that sort of thing. So it's a very messy war and a huge number of deaths because of it. It will come to an end eventually in 1648 with the Treaty of Westphalia, probably one of those big important treaties that you need to know in European history. France is going to come out the big winners of this. They're going to get the lion's share of the goodies. The Austrian Habsburgs are going to lose quite a bit. They'll gain some land, but not the choice land that they wanted. Spain will be weakened. Its Atlantic Empire is going to be partially taken away. It's going to be whittled away. It's very difficult for even a kingdom the size of and richness of Spain to guard all of this land in South America. So other people are going to come in, whittle away, steal from them, etc. Spain is also going to have another problem. It's going to have that economic problem of too much silver coming in and going directly into the hands of the crowns and not being able to be spread around fast enough. So the Spanish are having to fight wars on multiple fronts, having to rebuild navies. It's going to have a whole start this ball rolling of having to raise more taxes, and the people are going to revolt. And eventually Portugal will get its independence from Spain, And Spain will kind of lose very much of its power. France, however, France will start up as a true centralized, powerful government. It's going to move into an era in which once Henry IV has died, the Cardinal Richelieu will take over. The child of Henry IV is too young to take power, so Richelieu is taking power in essence. Now, if Richelieu sounds like a somewhat familiar name, if you've ever read The Three Musketeers, or know anything about it, or have seen the movie, there you go. That's Cardinal Richelieu. That's who they're talking about. The Three Musketeers are not on Richelieu's side. The Three Musketeers are on the king's side. Richelieu is going to take the Edict of Nantes and say, end it. He's going to not quite tear it up, but he's going to rescind a whole bunch of the privileges that the Protestant Huguenots had, especially political and military rights. Richelieu is going to impose very heavy taxes on the areas that had been autonomous, which is, not going to make them very happy. But these policies and the gains in the war are going to make France rich, or at least the King of France and his administration rich. If you recall, it's a very centralized government. Everything goes through the King of France. And so consequently, the more money they have, the more power they have. The revolts that are going to happen because Richelieu has overstepped his boundaries and rescinded these privileges for the Protestants and has been charging extra taxes, this is going to come to a head. There will be revolts breaking out throughout France against Richelieu's successor, Cardinal Mazarin, in 1643, and against the young king. This is 5-year-old Louis XIV. You can see by his picture. He's a very young man, but he's got some pretty elegant clothes. So he's going to impose new taxes, and when he finally is old enough to rule, he will rule in his own right. Louis XIV will be known as the Sun King. He will be the very essence of an absolute monarch. He will be who everyone in history will point to and say, that guy was an amazing king. He ruled for well over 50 years and turned France into an extraordinarily powerful and unquestionably rich kingdom. England was a little bit different. England, of course, was a decentralized government. The king or the queen, Elizabeth I, did not have the kind of power that the absolute monarchy in France had. She had to deal with Parliament. And this will be true of her successor, James I. Elizabeth, if you recall, signed the Elizabethan Compromise saying that she would never marry and consequently had to accept the fact that she would have no offspring, no heirs. The crown had to go to a cousin, James I, who was already at that moment King of Scotland. So this is the first time Scotland and England are united by a single monarch. James is going to inherit the throne. There's been debt incurred and plenty of factionalism thanks to religious intolerance and people wanting to worship in the way they wanted to. James is going to attempt to raise revenues without parliamentary approval. Not necessarily taxes. He was putting in tariffs and fees and all sorts of things that he tried to get more money without having to go through Parliament. But this is going to irritate a lot of people in the Kingdom of England, especially the Calvinist Scots, especially the Catholics in Ireland. So there's going to be a lot of unrest. There was a lot of unrest under James I. And part of that unrest broke out in the form of terrorism, otherwise known as the Gunpowder Plot.
This odd-looking doll is known in England as a guy, and despite the hours of work he took to create, he is not long for this world.
Remember, the 5th of November, the Gunpowder, treason and plot. We know no reason why gunpowder, treason should ever be forgotten.
On November 5th, 1605, King James was scheduled to address Parliament. Shortly after midnight that morning, the original Guy Fawkes was found guarding several kegs of gunpowder in the basement of the Parliament building. To James and his supporters, the uncovering of the conspiracy was a miracle. God had saved England and the government of King James. Surely God approved of the efforts being undertaken. Had the conspiracy been successful, England would have returned to the Catholic fold. The blessing of God upon King James and his supporters is still celebrated each year after more than 4 centuries.
The conspirators were tried, and then they were executed, generally speaking, in pretty odious ways. Look up the term drawn and quartered. It's particularly nasty. This is what they did or were going to do to Guy Fawkes. Knowing that he was about to be hung until mostly dead and then cut up into little pieces, he was going to deny the crowd this entertainment, and he threw himself off of the scaffolding and broke his neck and pretty much died there. But they carried on with the execution anyway, because, the crowd was there. Fast forward to just a few years ago, when the graphic novel V for Vendetta came out, and the character who is leading the rebellion in this graphic novel, and then later the movie, wears a mask that is the Guy Fawkes mask. And so when you see Anonymous adopt this mask that is from this graphic novel, V for Vendetta, that's hearkening back to Guy Fawkes and the Gunpowder Plot. So it's interesting how people take bits of history and rework them. You're able to argue, was Guy Fawkes a hero for trying to subvert the king, or was Guy Fawkes a terrorist? That's one of those interesting historical questions that you can argue all day. Anyway, James had a particularly quiet rule, and his oldest son, who was to take the throne, had died before he could be made king. And so James's second son, Charles, becomes king in 1625. Charles was just the wrong type of person to be king. He was very introverted, very intellectual. He wanted to be left alone. And instead, he is thrust into the limelight to become king. But one of the first things he tried to do was launch another war against Spain, and he wanted more money. Parliament did not want to grant the funds for him to pursue this war. He follows his father's example by raising money through raising tariffs, raising fees. He went a little bit beyond that and started confiscating land from nobles who did not support him and then selling it off. It was not a very cool way to go about it, and Parliament was furious about this. They joined and passed the Petition of Right in 1628, declaring illegal all taxes and fees that had not been condoned by Parliament. They wanted to take away this this arbitrary imprisonment and martial law in times of peace, because Charles was playing those kind of games, and they prohibited the quartering of soldiers in private homes, which was something Charles was trying to do as well, to find the nobles who weren't supporting him. So he had made himself extremely unpopular with Parliament, and Parliament fought back, trying to cut those apron strings that, those strings that Charles had laid out to try to make money to start this war. So Charles disbanded Parliament, did not call them into order, because the king has to call the Parliament into order. That was within his rights. He began to favor more Catholic-leaning people in England because they tended to support him. There was a lot of question, was Charles a Catholic? Hard to tell. But Charles still cannot get enough money for his war. He is going to be forced to call Parliament. And Parliament is going to pass even more laws against what Charles is trying to do. Charles, in fact, tried to arrest members of Parliament and force his own agenda. He will also have to go on and he will create his own army. Parliament is going to resist. Parliament resisted by starting their own army. And so all of a sudden, you had two armies, one led by the king and one led by the Parliament. And it erupts into open warfare, the English Civil War. It's known like the American Civil War. You've got the Blues and the Grays, the Union and the Confederates. In England, they're the Cavaliers and the Roundheads. The Cavaliers were the supporters of Charles I. They tended to be noble. They sometimes had Catholic sympathies, and they, generally speaking, were on horseback. The king had to hire mercenaries to do the infantry fighting. The nobles wanted to be on their horseback and fight that way. They're up against the Roundheads. These were the Puritans and the more dour members of Parliament who did not want all of this popery, as they called it. That's not the French term popery. It's things that were lined up with the Pope as they saw it. And they tended to be middle class, artisans, craftsmen, skilled labormen, very few nobles involved. They were called Roundheads because of their very short haircuts. They didn't like all this long flowing hair that the Cavaliers loved to wear. So you had the Cavaliers, the aristocrats, and large landowners. Those of you going to the University of Virginia, that's their emblem down there, the Cavaliers. Same guys. And the parliamentary supporters, the Roundheads, all these small landholders, tradesmen, artisans, sympathizers with a simpler Protestant religion. The king's forces are going to do very, very poorly. The fighting will be horribly violent because it's neighbor versus neighbor. And the Roundheads, the parliamentary troops, are going to be led by a very good general by the name of Oliver Cromwell, former member of Parliament, who is very busy trying to get the king's forces to surrender, which they will have to do in 1646. Charles escapes but comes back in 1648 to renew the war with more troops, but it's not enough. Cromwell has already gotten control of England. He seizes control of Parliament. He's got the troops. Much of Parliament sees the writing on the wall, realizes that something's got to give between the king and Parliament. And so many of them had left. And so Cromwell was left with his army, were very dedicated followers, and a very small number of parliamentarians, and they called themselves the Rump Parliament. This meant that there were only about 60 or 70 parliamentarians, where there normally had been over 400. So this Rump Parliament determines that as long as Charles I is alive and king, that this civil war will continue on. And so they put Charles on trial and find him guilty of going against the will of Parliament, which was tantamount to treason. And he will be executed publicly in 1649. Once the king is dead, horrifies all of Europe, because of course you just don't kill kings like that. Cromwell and the parliamentarians are going to declare England not a kingdom anymore, but a commonwealth, meaning that everybody has wealth in common. No, not quite. It's kind of a fancy term, more of a republic. However, what they'll do is get rid of the House of Lords, and so that august body that had been that hereditary part of Parliament, they will be gone, and Cromwell will take the mantle on himself, a very interesting title, the Lord Protector. In other words, he's going to become a dictator, an autocrat. He ruled England as a dictator for several years until his death. Oh, I forgot to show you a nice image of the execution of Charles I. It was done in a hurry because they were afraid of Charles's troops perhaps coming to free him. So it was done in a hurry on a very cold January day, and supposedly Charles wore 2 heavy shirts to his execution so the crowd couldn't see him shivering with the cold. That's kind of a weird priority, but, you know. Cromwell's dictatorship was very unpopular, especially in places like Catholic Ireland, because Cromwell insisted on a very strict type of Puritan observance. He canceled Christmas. He canceled theater. He canceled anything that was remotely involved in entertainment. I mean, these guys were really dour. These guys were hardcore. And so the English were not happy. The Irish were doubly unhappy. Cromwell organizes a new parliament, and they bump along for a little while, but Cromwell eventually dies and hands over the power to his son, who is not the person Cromwell was, and everything falls apart. Eventually, the monarchy is going to come back. The country has been ravaged. They want that steady hand of the monarchy, and to make sure, they will bring Charles's son, Charles II, to take the throne again. Charles II will revive the Church of England. He's going to bring back Christmas, yay. And he agrees to respect Parliament. He agrees to take into consideration that they have their own rights, and that he agrees to summon Parliament at least once every 3 years. Now, this image of Charles II, when you look at it very carefully, even though he reigned for 15 years, this is kind of a problematic image, because Charles II looked to someone he really respected to model his kingship after, and that was Louis XIV of France. Charles is going to adopt the same sort of clothing, the same sort of jewelry, hairstyle, elegant ermine robes, that sort of thing. And the British monarchy had not been quite that much. And there are rumors that Charles II might have been Catholic. So this is not settling well with the people in England. What happened with that English Civil War, how it's going to affect the New World? Well, it's going to start forcing people out of England. People who did not want to be involved in the Civil War, people who had grudges against other people in the Civil War. And in fact, at times, many of the military men, the generals on both sides, are going to be heading to the New World, basically, so they don't get killed by the other side. So the American colonies are going to start filling up with the people escaping the violence in the 30 Years' War and people escaping the violence in the English Civil War. So Parliament is going to look at these new settlers not as equal Englishmen. They are colonists. England will set up a system where everything that is grown in these colonies will come directly into England, and the people in the colonies will not be free to purchase goods outside of what the British insist on them. The British are going to demand bigger plantations. Bigger plantations mean the need for more workers, and more workers meant slavery. So slavery came to the United States quite early as part of an expansion of the growing plantations. During Elizabeth and James's reign, when people are just beginning to notice the New World, and it's very foreign, and it's very interesting. It sparks interest in them, and they're wondering about what's there, what type of people are there. And this kind of wondering just doesn't happen as part of people sitting around asking questions. The artists of the time will ask these questions. The the playwright William Shakespeare will be one of those Englishmen who was interested in the New World. His play, The Tempest, one of the last great plays that he wrote, talks about this magical island with these demons running around and these fairies running around on it. And it's full of promise, but it's also full of terror. So it's not a paradise, but it's also something that people got kind of excited about. So even though the politics in England looked ugly, being in America maybe looked like the solution and maybe not. Remember, there was a lot of deaths early on in the English colonies in America. And so word gets back at what a tough life this was. Another artist who tried to discuss the doubts and the wonder of the time was a Spaniard by the name of Miguel de Cervantes, who wrote a book called Don Quixote, which is a darling, wonderful novel about an old man who reads way too many fantasy and romance books about knights and chivalry and all this. And he decided he would become a knight errant. He would become a knight and go out on all of these quests. The book is a satire. It made fun of what Spain was like at the time, poking fun at the church a little bit. It poked fun at the social structure, and it did so in the form of an old man who was extremely optimistic, who wanted to work and be the best that he could be. So it's a very fun, touching little book. Because of what was seen as the disintegration of everything that's happening in Europe, no one can depend on the church anymore. No one can depend on the kings anymore. The intellectuals and commoners of the time are going to they started to ask questions. And so this doubt of the impermanence of everything will come out, like I said, in art, but also in very many other ways. Theater was terribly popular at the time in many places in Europe, places that hadn't banned it. Playhouses were where people gathered. It was a very social area with lots of people gathered to see each other as much as to watch plays. There was always vendors wandering around selling beer and food. The theaters were not the nice, stable, quiet places that we think of them now. Dark, everyone's facing in one direction, and we all are very quiet while we watch what's going on stage. Plays were not that way. And they didn't have things like big sets. They did not have scenery and special effects that much that we think of. And so everything had to be set with the words of the playwright. Playwrights such as Christopher Marlowe and William Shakespeare, and Marlowe was far more popular than Shakespeare at the time, but these men had to set the stage, as it were, with their language. If it was supposed to be a storm taking place in the play, they had to describe it. So to a modern audience, we find that stuff boring. But to the Shakespearean audiences of the time, that was how they built the images in their mind. Now, Marlowe and Shakespeare also wrote plays about the human condition and wrote plays that resonate with us today. The other playwrights that wrote plays at the time that weren't quite so meaningful, a lot of those plays you just find them in libraries or archives. Shakespeare, we still produce today, and that says something about the quality of his work and how he touches humanity that we would recognize. Painters in Europe, we have just come out of that era of the Renaissance and these amazing works of art that are very realistic. Where do you go from there? This was a problem the artists had to face. Do you keep reproducing perfection? And some artists, like El Greco, he was a Spaniard. Well, actually, he was in Spain, but he was a Greek. That's why they called him El Greco. His paintings did not focus on realism. They focused on the manners, the movement of the person being painted. How do you paint movement? How do you paint manners? Well, El Greco does, by not painting things perfectly, photographically excellent. But outside of a handful of amazing artists painting in the manneristic style like El Greco, there was an explosion of an art form known as the Baroque. Think cute little cherubs with the little wings and the little puffy clouds and people dancing on cloud. Anyway, I'll show you some pictures. The style is extraordinarily elaborate. The idea is to show off as much wealth as possible. It was encouraged by the Catholic Church, showing off how wealthy they were. There would be amazing sculptors. Bernini will create these artistic sculptures and pieces of architecture that still amaze us today. Velázquez will be painting not so much of the flamboyant style of Baroque, but a bit more introspectively. So let me show you some pictures. This is El Greco. This is the guy painting in the Mannerist tradition. And his work is, well, it's not picture-perfect realistic. It's almost cartoony, but look at the motion in those robes, the backgrounds. Look at the emotions on these people's faces. Even though their hands are kind of elongated, they're very sympathetic individuals, very interesting individuals. You're not going to look away from these guys, and you're not going to forget them either, because those beautiful faces are there searing into your mind, and you're really feeling a lot of emotion as you look at them. Here's Bernini, the great Baroque artist, lots of curlicues. Now this guy's showing off. If you look at that horse only has 2 hooves on the ground. It is impossible to balance a statue that way. You have to look very closely to look under the gut of the horse to see, in fact, that there's these bushes holding him up. The weight is actually balanced on those bushes, not on those rear hooves. So, but look at that flow and that movement, and the horse is just way too pretty, and the man is just way too pretty. But it's a pretty impressive piece of sculpture. And Velázquez. Velázquez was a court painter. He painted for noblemen and kings, and this is one of his most famous portraits of the king and queen. But you don't see them. Well, actually you do. This little drama going on is, in fact, the portrait painter Velázquez. He's the guy on the left. You can see he's got his paintbrush and his palette in front of him. But there's a little girl in the middle with everyone's focused on this little girl. Obviously the daughter of the king and queen. Obviously this pampered little princess. I mean, she'd make the perfect Disney princess. And she's got dogs. She's got friends who are obviously taking care of her. And there's some strange dwarves, and you're wondering, who are these people? What are they doing there? And they might have been court jesters. They might have been just playmates of this little princess. They might have been, who knows? I mean, but they're interesting in that their faces are not very pretty, but they're very elegantly dressed. Just behind that little tableau, you see a nun and some sort of official. They're looking on. And there's a gentleman who's just leaving the room. He's just opened the door and he's going out into a bright hallway. And so there's all this movement in this painting. There's all these things going on. Now, have you looked at it long enough to see the king and queen? Look next to the door, just to the left. They are being reflected in a mirror. And so when you see this painting, you are seeing the portrait artist obviously painting their portrait. They are posing for it. And that mirror just happens to be placed in the back of the room so that they can be seen, almost in a haphazard way. But of course, nothing in a painting is haphazard. Especially with a painter as good as Velázquez. So this isn't just a portrait. This is a little scene playing out, and you're wondering what's going on, and you've got a little drama going in your head about what's happening. And you could sit for hours and look at this painting. The Dutch are going to be painting. They're going to be adding all of their brilliance into this era. And they are not going to paint perfectly the perfect bodies and the perfect images. Just like mannerism, they're going to have their own styles. Peter Bruegel, who is going to paint peasants, he's going to have witnessed the violence of the period, and he's going to be putting what he understood into his paintings. His paintings are very subtle. Rubens, Peter Paul Rubens, will be painting thousands of canvases for the Catholics. He's going to be one of their favorite painters. And so I will show you some of one of his works, and you'll immediately go, oh yeah, that guy. And then the last guy, Rembrandt van Rijn, who was a Calvinist, lived in Holland, and was a very realistic painter, but he also had a craft to his painting, and I'll show you that in a second. So first, Bruegel. This seems to be a wintry setting, and it doesn't look all that realistic. Bruegel, you can feel it cold, but it's not this perfect picture. And you have to get in there close and wondering what they're doing. He has painted in this picture the murder of the innocents. It's a story in the New Testament where Herod, hearing about the birth of Jesus, wants to have all of the children, the boy children under 2 years old, murdered. Historians are not quite sure that this actually happened, but this is one of the traditions in the New Testament. Anyway, so this is something that Bruegel is bringing his understanding of the persecution and the murder that's happened in these wars of religion. And there it is lying out on the snow, and you can see the mothers begging for their children and the horror of these innocent children being slaughtered. Peter Paul Rubens, the man who painted for the Catholic Church. You've got the little putti, the little cherubs with the little wings. This is actually Mars carrying off Aphrodite, or Mars carrying off Venus. And you see the writhing of the bodies all over. Rubens, when he painted women, he painted robust women. How about that? He painted women of a certain weight. And so oftentimes you will hear women who are overweight described as being Rubenesque. Well, this is after this painter. And this is book painting right here. This is unescapably what you see in the Baroque style, the true Baroque style. And then Rembrandt. Rembrandt has an entire museum in Amsterdam devoted to his work. There's a few other people in it, but the museum has his work. This painting, The Shooting Company, it's also called The Night Watch. It's called The Night Watch because it's a dark painting. This is a company, this is a people's militia that was formed to protect the city, and the men who were part of the militia had to buy their own weapons, and, you know, they're not uniformed in some way that you would actually understand, but they wanted to have their portrait painted by Rembrandt, and so they paid good money to be in this portrait. And if you look very carefully, yes, you will see the guys who gave the most amount of money are very easily seen, and the guys who didn't pay as much money, maybe they're stuck in the background. But Rembrandt's use of light to move our eyes around in this picture is quite stunning. There's that little girl just to the left of the fellow in black with the red sash. So this little girl right there. And she's lit from nobody knows where. She's just kind of glowing there. And I'm sure she wasn't a member of the shooting company. Why is she there? She's just kind of a mystery. But she's this elegant little touch. Now this painting is huge. It takes up an entire wall of the museum. And when you go in, you see it, and your breath just is taken away. This picture just does not do it any sort of justice. And in front of this picture are benches. And when you're there, you're glad you're there, because you just want to sit and stare and look at how this man manipulates paint and how he makes paint say so much in simple words. So the world is changing. It's upset. The Columbian Exchange is bringing new things to Europe, as well as taking Europeans to the New World. So this time period, I'm leaving you for the semester as being very unsettled. And yet, out of some of these traditions, many of these problems that are happening at this time, the solutions that will be coming up to solve them are going to be extraordinarily important for the forming of the United States and for the forming of some of our sensibilities in the future. So I hope that this chapter was not too confusing. It jumps around a lot, and that's, of course, how it was written in the textbook. But I hope you get a feel for some of the interesting things that are happening in Europe at this time. Thanks a lot.